In his book, Travels Through Sacred India, Roger Housden shared his spiritual experiences in Sri Nannagaru's presence. Referring to it, Sri Nannagaru used to say, "Many devotees have spoken about me till date, but of all the devotees, I feel Roger has done justice to me."
There could hardly be two people more different than Punja and Nannagaru, though both ascribe their awakening to the grace of Ramana Maharishi. Nannagaru has spent much of his life as a farmer in a village of Andhra Pradesh in the region of the Godavari River. Some 20 years ago, a saint came to him in a dream and kissed him on the cheek. Sometime later, he saw an advertisement in the newspaper for a book on spirituality. The advertisement caught his eye, and he sent off for the book. When he opened it, he found the photo of the same saint who had kissed him. It was Ramana Maharishi, whom he had never heard of before. He made a pilgrimage to Ramana's ashram at Arunachala and frequently returned over the ensuing years, though Ramana had died some 15 years previously. His whole life began to turn on Ramana's teachings, and he began to preach Ramana's message in his neighborhood. Then, some years later, he was in Ramanashram when, in the morning, between sleeping and waking, he, as he put it to me, felt his mind falling once and for all into his heart. From then on, he was a changed man. It was as if he lived by a force other than the ordinary personality, which had gone into abeyance. People began to see him as their guru instead of a preacher, and his name quickly spread throughout Andhra Pradesh. Today, he travels throughout South India, staying at the home of one or another of his disciples for a few days and then moving on. Whenever he arrives somewhere, people from that area come all day long with their problems and pleas for help. He listens to them all with deep attention, blesses them, sits in silence with them, and gives a talk sometimes to the gathered assembly. He is the archetype of the traditional Indian guru, a soul doctor, a counselor, a friend, a wise guide in the affairs of life, and for those few who want it, a spiritual presence and teacher. I first came across Nannagaru in Ramanashram, at Thiruvannamalai, in the last days of 1993. A friend had told me that a guru was giving darshan near the library that evening. I thought Arunachala and Ramana's cave were sufficient for me. I felt no particular attraction for the darshan of yet another guru. However, the library was next to my room, and as I returned from the cave that evening, I saw a crowd of Westerners outside sitting in silence before a man in his early 60s sitting on a chair. At his feet were a bevy of well-dressed Indian women. They were all gazing at him intently. The man's eyes were drifting slowly from one person to another. I couldn't help feeling that he looked like the corner shop grocer. Occasionally, he let out a prolonged belch and rubbed his stomach. I sat down, intending to stay until the first mosquito arrived. In moments I was aware of the depth of the silence in the group around me. Nannagaru kept gazing at one individual after another, sometimes resting his eyes on a person for minutes. At the same time, he would raise his right hand in an open palm blessing. My body became as still as a stone. All thought of going anywhere vanished. All thoughts of any kind vanished. His look was one of the most tender compassion, of love to his beloved, yet there was no sense of anybody doing anything, wanting anything, trying to create some effect. Just the innocent and empty gaze of love, available to all, and yet intensely personal, it seemed with each individual. His body seemed to carry no tension at all. His whole being flowed unobstructed out of his eyes. After half an hour or so, he silently bowed and got up to go to his room. Nobody moved, and the silence continued for several more minutes. When I finally moved, I made my way to Nannagaru's door without forethought. It was half open, and one of his disciples was standing at the entrance. I asked if I could see Nannagaru, and the disciple ushered me in. Nannagaru was sitting on his bed. He had just picked up a newspaper. "Which country?" he asked. When I told him, he asked me if I read the Times. When I told him I didn't, he asked me about the other good newspapers in England. I responded briefly and then reached my point. "I was deeply touched by the silence you led us into just now," I said. "But what I really want is to be that silence myself, wherever I am. I cannot always be in India with someone like you. You like the silence?" he asked, leaning forward like a delighted child. "Come to Virupaksha cave with me tomorrow, and I shall answer your question." So I agreed to meet him at 3 p.m. the next afternoon when he would take me to the cave in his car. The next day at the appointed time, I piled into an ambassador car with half a dozen of Nannagaru's Indian devotees. Nannagaru himself led the way in another car. We drove into town and climbed the short path up to the cave, whose entrance was already packed with expectant faces. Nannagaru went into the cave, paid his respects to the place, and returned to sit under the tree outside. He then proceeded to speak to his Indian audience in his native Telugu for the next half an hour while the other Westerners and I sat in silence. The silence was tangible, even when he spoke, and it didn't matter that he never returned to my question. That evening he was on the floor in the ashram dining hall along with everyone else, quiet, inconspicuous, in an ordinary dhoti, without any special attention or favors. The man seemed to glide rather than walk through the day. That evening, when I arrived for his darshan, he motioned me to come and sit by his side. Every few minutes, he would look down with an innocent tenderness and stroke my head. To begin with, I felt a certain self-consciousness at receiving such undivided attention in public, but my awkwardness soon gave way to tranquility and ease that would remain with me for weeks afterward. The next day, Nannagaru was leaving. I was among the crowd that had gathered to see him off, and as he made his way to his car, he came over to me and held me in his arms. "Roger," he smiled. "Roger, like some lover taking his leave. I have since witnessed him act the same way with many people, treating each one as if they were the only person in the world. I have never seen such a living example of the way Krishna must have acted with the gopis." Some months later, I went to stay with Nannagaru in his village and accompanied him for a few days on his rounds through Andhra Pradesh. It was a journey into the heart of rural India. The village was built in a traditional style. The houses were not unlike Spanish haciendas, with verandas supported but carved wooden posts and red tiled roofs. Nannagaru would sit on his veranda, read the newspaper, and receive the trickle of people who came to see him. His family disapproved of the public attention they were getting, and discouraged Nannagaru from using their house as an open forum. This was one reason he now traveled so much. He put me up in a house next door, which belonged to a devotee who had gone away on business. On my first morning, there was a knock at the door, and I opened it to find Nannagaru with a cup of coffee. In the evening, he brought me into the kitchen of his house and stood over me as I made my way through the food his wife had prepared for me. "Nice food?" he inquired in his rudimentary English. "Very nice food?" When I confirmed my pleasure, he beamed, insisting on offering me more. "Very nice food," he repeated, "very nice food." Over the next week or so, we went to several different homes over an area of perhaps 100 miles, accompanied by one of his few male devotees who took charge of all the arrangements. At each stop, he and I were ushered to the table first while the women hovered around, watching us eat as he had watched me. Then the men of the family ate, and finally, the women and children sat down. During the day, dozens of people would come and sit at his feet while he would give them a talk on some aspect of Ramana's teaching, respond to their problems, or occasionally sit in silence. We went to 3 weddings, blessed the foundations of a new house, visited a paper factory, and a temple that someone had recently built in his honor. Nannagaru was the same still presence wherever he went. He flowed at the same slow pace and never showed any trace of a reactive mind. As we went from one place to the next in the car, he would gaze at a tiny picture of Ramana that he held in his lap, apparently lost to us and our journey. Yet, as soon as we stopped, he would be totally present in whatever situation we walked into. Several Westerners have now accompanied in this way, some for much longer periods than I. Everyone I have met confirms some experience of prolonged inner silence in his presence and nothing but an undemanding simplicity on his part. One, a 70-year-old from New York told me that he had watched Nannagaru weep for an hour while an old woman told him her story. He himself had not been aware of anything special happening to him while he was with Nannagaru, although it was a warm, if uneventful, time. Then, a few days after his departure, he realized that a sadness, which had been with him all his life, had vanished entirely. Since his own awakening was not the result of any specific sadhana other than a spontaneous love for Ramana Maharishi, it is not surprising that Nannagaru recommends no particular method or technique himself. His own way of working with people is clearly to have them in his presence while going about the business of everyday life. Being a householder himself, he doesn't separate the spiritual from the secular. Much of his day is spent dealing with people, everyday concerns, and playing his part in the life of his community. He will talk for hours to his Indian devotees on various aspects of Advaita teaching, but with Westerners, he is invariably silent, except when he asks about their country and their national press. His economy with words is partly because of his poor English, but also because he knows that many Westerners, unlike most Indians around him, seem to value his silence more. Westerners are already full of concepts and theories and are usually grateful to experience what lies beyond them. People come and go from him without any mention of a relationship of guru and disciple. He responds spontaneously to a person's openness, but his response carries no weight or demand. On the contrary, he seems to represent an invitation to fall into the inner heart, where all differences, formal relations, and emotional needs dissolve. Silence was also the teaching method of Ramana Maharishi, who considered it the only real form of communication. Yet Nannagaru's presence naturally draws people, and his Indian followers, being culturally attuned to the guru-disciple relationship, treat him accordingly. Nannagaru's followers have recently built a small retreat center near Ramanashram, in Thiruvannamalai, called Andhra Ashram. Nannagaru plans to be a resident there for some months each year, so he seems certain to become far more widely known than he is now.
This is a poem by Kabir, translated by Robert Bly, called The Time Before Death, which of course is now. Friend, hope for the guest while you are alive. Jump into experience while you're alive. Think and think while you're alive. What you call salvation belongs to the time before death. If you don't break your ropes, while you're alive, do you think ghosts will do it after? The idea that the soul will rejoin with the ecstatic just because the body is rotten, that's all fantasy. What is found now is found then. If you find nothing now, you'll simply end up with an apartment in the city of death. If you make love with the divine now, in the next life you will have the face of satisfied desire. So plunge into the truth. Find out who the teacher is. Believe in the great sound. Kabir says this: when the guest is being searched for, it is the intensity of the longing for the guest, that does all the work. Look at me, and you will see a slave of that intensity.